can't be in person, but c'est la vie. Okay, so first off, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors and postdoc advisors, Lou Botsford, Alan Hastings, and Will White. So my talk today is about quantifying resilience of fished and actually unfished populations to climate disturbances. Can you hear me and see my slides okay?
Yes.
Yep, everything's great.
Great. Okay, so a question that is common and that we want to know about is what impact do extreme events or pulses have on marine populations? So again, examples of marine extreme events include heat waves, like we've been seeing, hypoxic events, HABs, cyclones, hurricanes, storm surges, etc. I don't know why the animation is not playing, but Andy has a really cool blob tracker on his website down here that you can go check out. So marine heat waves. I found an interesting paper that had kind of a global perspective on heat waves that have occurred in recent history. And obviously the Northeast Pacific blob of 2014 is on there. So generally a heat wave is characterized by an increase in temperature above a certain threshold, right? So we're interested in how a population responds to this type of disturbance, and in our case, a multi-year disturbance. And as we know from the 2014-15 blob, there's been records of both winners and losers in regards to species that have been hit harder or have increased given warming temperatures across the Northeast Pacific. So what we're interested in from a theoretical perspective is to look at coastal kelp forest species populations and how they might respond to a given deleterious pulse, such as, for example, a marine heat wave. So I'm going to be showing this figure probably over and over again, but effectively it's, you have this black line representing a pulse disturbance to the population. So in our case, we're reducing recruitment by 50% over a duration of 5 years, we can change the duration of this pulse, but in general, this duration lasts for X amount of time, and then it goes back up. So the blue line is the population response to this pulse, where it declines, reaches a minimum point, and then exponentially recovers to its equilibrium state. So here we're starting at equilibrium, a population at equilibrium, and returning to that same equilibrium point. At the juncture of these two dashed red lines is the 95% recovery time. So the recovery time after the pulse, and which would be about 48 or so years here for this certain population. So that's generally how we're going to look at this. With these pulse disturbances comes into play the term resilience, and a lot of people like to use this term and not necessarily define it. So here I'm defining it for myself in regards to my chocolate consumption, but in regards to this presentation, we're dealing with something called engineering resilience. So effectively how quickly a system recovers after a pulse disturbance. So to get into the questions we were after understanding in a theoretical sense. So I know we've seen a lot of empirical data here. This is purely theoretical. So we're interested in what life history parameters might drive the recovery time for different species. how a population's recovery from a single pulse or multiple pulses is affected by fishing. And then then after we tried to grapple with these first two, we realized, the response to a pulse is really a multi-dimensional issue. And we're working on how best to quantify that. So backing out a little bit, our approach was a single patch population model with closed demographics, Beverton-Holt density dependence, and it was initialized at equilibrium. Our pulse or a noise response here, our pulse was effectively a single pulse or a double pulse, which I'll get into in a second, and a 50% reduction in recruitment. Of course, these can all change, as well as different year durations. We used for different species, we gathered different life history and fishing parameters from recent stock assessments. And okay, so yeah, getting into the first aspect of this talk is in regards to life history and how life history comes into play when we try to understand the recovery time for a given species. So again, we have this figure, this cartoon of how a population might respond to a given decrease in recruitment. And if you look at the different parts of this curve, so for example, the initial decrease slope, the maximum slope or return slope, as well as the recovery time, you get different relationships with natural mortality and age at maturity. So here we have initial slope being highly correlated with M, and as well as the recovery slope, and then age at maturity being correlated with, or recovery time being correlated with age at maturity. Okay, so how is a population's recovery from a single pulse disturbance affected by fishing? So here we have 3 different levels of fishing, or 2 different levels of fishing and 1 unfished level. And you see intuitively, the more fished you are, the longer your recovery time is going to be. So if you plot that for our list of species, you get a range of recovery times. And you can do these recovery times for different levels of fishing and different pulse lengths and impacts. So how to grapple with this multidimensional issue of the response to a pulse. So for linear systems, there's generally 3 components you can look at. The recovery rate of the system as a measure of recovery, the baseline normalized impact, so this amount, the maximum impact to the population, as well as the perturbation, which is effectively the integral between 1 and the curve. So the benefits to this is that this provides a coherent approach to comparing disturbances across ecosystems. The issue with this is that our models aren't linear, or in our closed model, they're not linear. So here I'm giving you an example of the 16 different species we're looking at and the population's response to 3 different pulses, so reducing recruitment by 0.5 and at 2, so at 2, 5, and 10-year pulse durations. And the shading under the curve, over the curve, is this metric of perturbation. So to get at this multidimensionality of resilience, we plot the bivariate resilience. So effectively, how we're plotting it here is recovery time on the Y against the impact, so the amount of decrease in the population. And the quadrant you'd probably be in if you were the most resilient you'd have the least impact and the quickest recovery time here, and you'd have the longest recovery time and largest impact here, so you wouldn't be as resilient if you're in this quadrant. So if we plot out for the 16 different species we looked at, generally they fall out like this, and I apologize that some of the names are on top of each other. This is definitely a work in progress, so I'm open to feedback and suggestions, but with the way we're looking at it now, given 0.5 reduction in recruitment over a 5-year time period, you get this distribution of species with China rockfish and black and yellow rockfish falling within that more resilient quadrant than the other species. Of course, these quadrants are arbitrary and can be moved around, but just as a first order look at things, I thought this was a good way to do it. And then I've been playing around with different pulse shapes, different pulse impacts, so how much the recruits are impacted. So if, for example, you have a single pulse for a 10-year duration, this is what the recovery time and impact for these species look like. If you compare that to the almost 100% decrease in recruits for 5-year durations for 2 pulses, for example, that are 5 years in length, separated by 2 years, you get this distribution of recovery times and impacts. So yeah, as you would expect, the more severe the pulse, the more time it'll take to recover and the more impact you'd see in the population. So our modeling has allowed us to understand not only how actually quantify and write down how much fishing impacts the recovery to a single pulse or a multi-year pulse, and then we can come up with recovery time and how that depends on life history and prior fishing levels. And then we've started to plot out this bivariate resilience, or this approach to looking at more than just one aspect of the shape of the impact to the population. So I've obviously been hanging out with my 5-year-old a little too much here, but in the study, we're assuming a single or a double pulse. Of course, continuous noise is more is common in natural systems, and that's kind of our next study, our next paper. And then again, we're assuming that the population bounces back to the same level of biomass abundance as before. So the next steps might be to understand how maintaining age structure, for example, within MPAs, how does the maintenance of the age structure afford resilience or not to sequential disturbances? So we can look at the different percentage of the coastline within an MPA and different pulse impacts and durations. And it'd probably be cool to make a Shiny app to be able to visualize all this, but not there yet. Anyway, so the relevance to species management and conservation is that one of the takeaways from this is that if impacted, it could potentially take decades for a certain kelp forest species to bounce back after a marine heat wave. With MPAs or no fishing, there's likely shorter recovery time. So the life history of the species definitely dictates the time to recovery as well as the impact. And again, this approach will allow us to be able to compare resilience recovery time across systems. So with that, again, this is definitely a work in progress, but thank you for tuning in, and I'll take any questions, comments, or suggestions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Caren.